Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 17. I blinked at the light floating in Isabel's palm as it pulsed, shifting to a red hue and then slowly from purple to blue. I didn't like the light. It made me feel dizzy. My head was swimming and my temples were pounding with pressure and pain. I didn't know why my head hurt so bad. You must be drunk. But I didn't remember drinking. That didn't make sense. But it's the only rational explanation. And then there was the bear. Or was there really a bear? Had I just imagined it in some kind of drunken stupor? My stomach writhed and I turned onto my side, still laying on the floor. I had to crawl into Isabel's bathroom as soon as possible. I didn't want to puke on her floor. Isabel grabbed my arm and shoved her palm in front of my face. The tiny ball of light was blinding. "Don't look away," Isabel said, her voice urgent. "Eliza, look at my hand." "Stop it," I mumbled groggily. "My head hurts." I didn't know what Isabel was doing or why she was shining a flashlight in my eyes. I felt sick, and my vision was too blurry to see straight. It was a strange flashlight, shifting colors like that. Stripping was supposed to pay pretty well. At least that's what everyone said. But Isabel was living in a trailer. I guess she spent her money on weird stuff like fancy flashlights. "Keep your eyes on the light," Isabel said. "Eliza, please, this is important." "Stop it," I groaned. "I think I'm gonna throw up." "There's nothing wrong with you," Isabel said. "You just don't want to believe your eyes." What the hell was she talking about? I wanted to push past Isabel and go into the bathroom, but my head was pounding too much for me to shove her out of the way. "Look at the light," Isabel said. "Where is it coming from?" "I don't feel good," I repeated. It came out as a petulant whine. My stomach was churning painfully, and my head felt like it was being stabbed by white-hot knives. I could feel my nose running. My forehead was burning. My body was covered in cold sweat. "Eliza," Isabel said, "tell me where the light is coming from." "I think I have a fever," I complained. "Eliza," Isabel said, "look at the light." I groaned and closed my eyes. This felt like the worst flu I had ever had. I didn't know why I suddenly felt so sick, but I just wanted it to stop. I felt a sudden sharp pain against my cheek that made my head roll against the floor. Isabel had slapped me. I couldn't believe she did that. Couldn't she see that I felt terrible? "Eliza, I know it's hard, but you'll feel better if you just focus on the light, I promise." I blinked my eyes open to glare at the woman who had slapped me. I couldn't believe that she wouldn't leave me alone. The ball of light floating in Isabel's outstretched palm was pulsing from green to blue. A tiny sphere of light in the air with no apparent source. I didn't see any rings on Isabel's fingers that could have projected a hologram. I raised a finger to rub at my eyes, but Isabel seized my wrist with her free hand, still keeping the other poised in front of my face with that damned glowing light. "Don't look away, Eliza. Focus on the light. Think about it. And try to remember what just happened when you fought off the bear." "What? A bear?" "You have to try to remember what you did to the bear," Isabel said. "Eliza, stay with me. You have to fight this." "Fight what? The bear?" The bear had run off. The smell of charred flesh filled my nostrils, a smell that had been in my nose this entire time. For some reason, I had stopped noticing it, though it was hard to imagine why. The scent was acrid. And then a thought struck me. Isabel had wanted to tell me something, but she said I wouldn't believe her. She said she knew it was crazy. The woman had seemed sane apart from that one strange pronouncement she had made about a global conspiracy. And now she was trying to tell me something that would sound crazy. Something my mind wanted to reject. I coughed, and the motion of it exploded across my mind like a wave breaking against the shore, flowing through me and washing away the pounding ache in my head. The churning in my stomach started to settle. I blinked slowly as my head cleared, and then I looked up at Isabel. I was lying on the floor. The blonde woman in the red bathrobe was sitting over me and biting her lip, her eyes wide with apprehension. She had pinned one of my wrists against the floor with her left hand and had restrained my other hand by sitting on my other arm. I had barely noticed the fact that I had been physically struggling with her. The pain and nausea had been too intense for me to be much aware of anything else. Isabel's right hand was stretched out in front of my face. The tiny ball of light was hanging in the air in front of her hand. I blinked at the light, and suddenly it was all rushing back to me, so vividly that it was almost as if it was happening again. The bear turning toward me, running at me, teeth bared. Fear so intense that I could practically feel the animal's teeth tearing into my throat. The bear was coming at me, and I knew I was going to die, and then I felt something. A thrumming sort of energy just out of reach, something I could grasp and force between myself and the bear. And there was a flash of light, a crackling sound like a taser, the acrid smell of burnt hair, and then the bear was running away. I blinked and looked again at the tiny ball of light floating in front of me, as if for the first time. What? How? Tension fled Isabel's face. She released my wrist and smiled. She moved her other hand over to the glowing ball of light, and it grew larger between her fingers until it was the size of a basketball. I stared at the light in utter bewilderment. For Angie, it was fire, Isabel said. My mind was barely able to register that I knew who Isabel was talking about. Angela Miller, the woman Zev had been talking to before she disappeared. The woman with a magic act where she produced fire out of nowhere. For me, it's this, Isabel said. I kept staring at the ball of light. It wasn't actually too bright to look at least not now. It was an impossible thing, like a hologram. But that was science fiction. And yet, I couldn't deny what was right in front of me, what my eyes were showing me. But, I said, and then trailed off. Isabel waited for me. I stared at the ball of light for another moment. That light was impossible. It had to be. But there it was. Isabel had said that I wouldn't believe her. She said she knew how it would sound. My brain churned and sputtered like a stalling engine. But how? I finally asked. I don't know, Isabel said. I just do it. I lifted my hand toward the orb of light. Is it safe to touch? Go ahead. I stretched out my fingers toward the little hologram and gingerly laid my fingers on it. My hand passed into the light without causing so much as a flicker. There was no substance behind the little glowing ball, although it did feel a bit warmer than the air surrounding it. I pulled my hand back and stared at my own fingers for a second before looking back at the ball of light again. Holy shit, I whispered, stretching out the words. Isabel grinned and let out a breath. I could see the tension dropping out of her shoulders. This is why I said you wouldn't believe me, she said. I frowned from my perch on the edge of Isabel's bed. The door to the bedroom was open, and I could feel a draft from the hole the bear had left behind when it knocked her front door in. So, magic is real, I said. Magic. Literal magical powers. And the reason why no one notices is because any time someone does, the universe roofies you? Seriously? Isabel frowned before answering. She stepped toward her dresser and started stuffing more clothes into her bag. Her movements were relatively smooth. The cuts on her back had been surprisingly shallow. Definitely painful, but not a bad enough injury to inhibit the woman's mobility. It was a little strange. That bear was a huge animal. It seemed like it could have easily done more damage than it had. I didn't know what to make of the bear's behavior, but I didn't know what to make of anything at the moment. My mind was a swirling mass of confusion and fear. I was managing to keep a brave face on, but I was petrified. I didn't want to believe in what Isabel was saying, but the glowing ball of light was still spinning around her wrist. With every rotation, that little ball contradicted doubts that kept trying to rise into my head. The little ball of color-shifting light gave me no choice but to accept the reality that was staring me in the face, and that reality was terrifying. It meant that my whole conception of the world was wrong, that my world was no longer a rational, predictable place. Anything could happen. Anything. And there might be nothing I could do to stop it. Part of me wanted to run out to my van and lock all the doors and curl up shivering under my blankets and squeeze my eyes shut and hope to God that when I opened them, I woke up in my bed at the Northside Residence Hall. But what was happening here wasn't a dream. My foot was stinging a little where the broken glass had scraped it, so there was no need to pinch myself. And that ball of light was still spinning around Isabel's wrist. There was no way to deny what was right in front of my eyes. Trying to hide from the truth wouldn't make it go away anyway. I had to accept it, try to understand it. Isabel was still frowning pensively as she continued packing. Part of me wanted to rush her, to get her to speak, to explain things, to give me something to latch onto. But I didn't want to betray how scared I was. And I didn't want Isabel to think that I was a weak person. It might sound silly, but my pride was probably the only thing that kept me from falling to pieces. I felt like I was on the brink of collapsing into a shuddering, crying mess, but I couldn't let myself do that with an audience. So I held it together, sitting quietly as I waited for Isabel to gather her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "I don't think it's the universe messing with people's heads," she said. Angela said that she felt like her powers were like another consciousness that her mind could connect to. This is all just guessing, but I think magic is something that responds to our thoughts and desires. So if you don't want to believe what you're seeing, it hears you, and it tries to help you, to give you what you want. I frowned down at my hands and started cracking my knuckles. I was so agitated I felt like screaming, but I managed to contain myself. I had to shove my panicked feelings down and focus on getting more information. I had to know what I was dealing with. Knowledge would give me a leg to stand on. I forced myself to take a deep breath and consider what Isabel had said. So, magic itself is like a living thing? Isabel paused again before answering. I think that might be going a little far. I don't think magic has a will of its own. I think it's just an energy that responds to our thoughts and feelings. Why didn't you show me the ball of light before? I tried. Do you remember when I asked to talk to you in the back of your van? I tried to make the ball of light appear, but I couldn't. I remembered Isabel's Shakespearean gesticulation, holding her hand out and staring at it. That's what that was? Isabel nodded. Wait, I said, but if I was able to stop you, how come Angie was able to make fire appear right in front of Zev? He's as skeptical as they come. Was it because she told him she was about to show him a magic trick, so his, defenses were down? Could be, but I'm also not as strong as Angie was. Maybe I don't believe in my powers as much as she believed in hers. I don't know. Angie could make fire, but for me, well, I'm all light and no heat. Isabel's voice fell. I can change the color of the light, and Angie couldn't do that with her fire, but, well, you saw how useful it was when the bear came. I shuddered at the mention of the bear. Isabel went quiet. She was staring down at her hands, looking both sad and frustrated. I abruptly realized what Isabel must be feeling. She must have thought that her magical talent was something pretty and ethereal because she, as a person, was nothing but pretty and ethereal. All light and no heat was how Isabel thought about herself in comparison to Angela on every level. A darker part of my mind wondered if there was some truth to that. I didn't know much about Angela Miller, but she sounded like a braver person than Isabel seemed to be. Maybe personality was the reason Isabel created a light show while Angela Miller conjured fire. Part of me wished that I could talk to Angela Miller directly. The way Isabel spoke made it sound like she was the one who knew the most. But Angela Miller was missing, and Isabel thought she was dead. Isabel was also right in front of me, and clearly feeling down on herself. I felt guilty for not immediately reacting with compassion. I should try to comfort the woman, but I had no idea what to say to her. If someone else noticed something I was insecure about, I wouldn't want them to mention it. Even if someone was trying to be compassionate, it would just make me feel worse to know that one of my weaknesses was exposed. So I didn't say anything. The silence in the room stretched. Until, at last, Isabel filled it. That was why Angie started her magic act, Isabel said, to test her theories. Angie couldn't usually make fire appear in her hands when a whole crowd of people were watching her, but when she got on stage and told everyone she was a magician, she found that she could do it. People were expecting to see the impossible, and I guess that made it possible. I frowned and pondered that. Isabel continued. Angie said it was proof that everyone has psi potential, that they exert their own power over reality, that what's possible depends on what people believe is possible. I don't know how true it all is, but it makes sense with how it was for me. How was it for you? I asked. Isabel hesitated. She turned toward me and gave me a probing look. I bit my lip, unsure of what she was looking for. Did she sense the maelstrom of nervous energy that I was struggling to contain? Did she think I wasn't strong enough to handle what she was about to tell me? Isabel took in a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something. I think Angela's theory explains why it's so hard to find out about magic. I think that magic is deeply connected with what you believe is true about yourself and the world. So when something threatens that, well, you said you felt like you were getting drunk. For me, it was worse. Isabel turned away from me. Her voice sounded tight. I thought I was going crazy. What do you mean? I asked. She looked embarrassed. I mean, I thought I was developing schizophrenia. And it wasn't just when Angela was trying to show me a flame in her hands. I started hearing voices, too. It was like my mind was adding in extra hallucinations to make it easier to dismiss what I was seeing Angie do, so I could tell myself that it was just another hallucination. Isabel started digging into her dresser. I wasn't sure if she was looking for something specific or if she just wanted an excuse to keep her face turned away from me. Silence hung in the air. I tried to think of what to say as the silence stretched. If I wanted Isabel to keep talking, I had to say the right thing. I could tell that Isabel was worried that I would judge her or think that she really was crazy. I had to set her at ease. That, must have been hard, I hazarded. Isabel stiffened and my heart sank. I had screwed it up, hadn't I? Yeah, Isabel whispered. She raised her hands to her eyes, possibly to wipe away tears that I couldn't see from this angle. It was. Another silence stretched. Damn it. I had just made her feel worse. I was such an idiot. I was still struggling to think of something to say when, to my great relief, Isabel spoke up. I think that, for me, the idea that I had schizophrenia was easier to accept than the idea that Angie had magical powers. It was just... my mother had I was always worried that I... Isabel's voice became hoarse with emotion, and she leaned on her dresser, still facing away from me. I felt a pang of empathy for what she had said. I didn't know what Isabel's pain was like when she thought about her own mother, but I knew what it was like to start feeling sad and angry every time the subject of mothers came up. I also knew that Isabel had just revealed something deep and painful about her past. I couldn't just ignore that and get her to keep talking. I was terrible at emotional conversations, but I did know that there was an unspoken rule that when one person shares something deeply personal, the other person is obligated to respond in kind. I think I get it, I said. I mean, that it's something your mind does to itself, not something the universe does to you. I clenched my fists. I had to tell Isabel. She had shared something of herself. I had to share something back, even if I hated even thinking about it. I cleared my throat. My mom, I said, she was an alcoholic, and I guess that was always kind of hanging over me. So when I see something crazy, the explanation my brain jumps to is that I must be drunk, even though I knew I hadn't been drinking, even though I know I don't even like alcohol. I blinked after I said that last bit. And that's when I realized that this wasn't the first time in the past few days that I had felt my mind trying to convince itself that I must have been drinking. "Oh my God," I said aloud. "What?" Isabel said. "What is it?" She spun around to face me, startled. Her eyes were red and watery. I just realized something," I said. My mind was reeling with revelation, and I was too distracted to elaborate. Tonight with Isabel wasn't the first or even the second time that I had started thinking that I was drunk out of nowhere. There was the night of the fire, and then in that parking lot when I thought I saw the guy in the cowboy hat lift the van. Maybe Reuben Chalmers really had lifted the van. Maybe he had powers like Isabel and Angela Miller. I could remember what it felt like when I saw the wheel rise up off the ground. I was terrified. I didn't want it to be true. And then I landed on an excuse. Maybe I was drunk. And then I had started feeling drunk. But that thought had made so little sense that I had managed to talk myself out of it. I had somehow convinced myself that it had been some kind of trick, some kind of carny illusion that had only made it look like Chalmers had lifted my van up off the ground. And I didn't start feeling less woozy until I had come up with an explanation that had allowed me to dismiss what had just happened to me in some way other than drunkenness. "What?" Isabel asked. She was zipping up her bag and looking at me with an expression of concern. And then there was the fire. The night Zev had disappeared. There was a big blank spot in my memory, before I had woken up with a bump on my head and the taste of alcohol on my breath. Even then, I had known that the idea that I had gone on a bender had made no sense. But I had never considered that the reason for what had happened to me might be supernatural. "Holy shit," I whispered. "You okay?" Isabel said. She had just finished zipping her bag and was starting to take a step toward me. "Holy shit," I said, louder. It was all I could do to manage that reply. My thoughts were whirling around me, disorienting. The room was spinning. Dimly, I was aware that I was sliding off of the bed and onto the floor. I felt my knees hit the ground. I could remember it. A childhood nightmare. A scarecrow with a crooked face. One blue fabric eye sewn significantly higher than the other. It had really happened. It was all real. Monsters were real. I could remember that night. I could remember the pupils that glanced away to one side as though the scarecrow was hiding something, and that twisted button smile, a cruel, malicious smile, like the scarecrow knew how frightening it looked, and he thought it was funny. I could remember the scarecrow lurching at me, pulling its arm free of the twine that held it to swing at me when my father and I first arrived to move into the farmhouse. And then suddenly I could see it from a different angle. I could remember being small and standing on my tiptoes to see out my bedroom window. As I watched, the scarecrow started moving. Slowly, jerkily, he raised his hand and clasped the fingers of the old glove until only the index finger was extended. The scarecrow pointed that finger at me, and then he dragged it across his throat. I screamed. The scarecrow threw back its head, as if in laughter. The world spun and went dark. Distantly, I could feel the side of my head knocking painfully against the floor of Isabel's bedroom. Chapter 18. Flames wreathed the Riverside Sentinel, ripping their way out of the building's windows and clawing up at the full moon, hanging huge in the night sky. Firelight flickered across the grass and into the forest. I stood at the edge of the trees, watching as the fire made their shadows dance and writhe behind the tree line, like long hands twisting with 2, 3, or 4 long fingers ready to grab me if I stepped into the woods. I backed away from the forest until the heat of the flames behind me became uncomfortably warm. Then I turned around again to stare at the building that had been my home as it burned. No, that wasn't right, I thought. The building that was on fire was the Sentinel, but I lived at Northside. Wasn't that the building that was supposed to be on fire? And what was the Sentinel doing here at the edge of this forest? The Sentinel was supposed to be downtown. And where were the fire trucks? A voice from behind interrupted my thoughts. It was high-pitched for a man and thick with snark. "Well, look at you," he said. "Zev," I answered, spinning back toward the woods. He was standing just inside the dark forest, leaning against a tree and grinning. Shadows pawed at his narrow, impish face, but they didn't seem to bother him. In the gaps between the shadows, the light from the flames and the moon glinted off his bleached blonde hair, carefully combed to look like it had been carelessly tousled. "You didn't look," he said. "What?" "I said to look at yourself." I glanced down at the blood on my hands. Zev was abruptly standing next to me, wearing a toothy grin that drew my eye to his canines. "Whatever," Zev said. "I forgive you." I blinked at him. "What?" I said. "I never did anything to you. You're the one who's always—" Zev interrupted me. "Yeah, I figured you didn't mean to," he said, rolling his eyes. "I'm not a dumbass." First he was interrupting me, and now he was calling me names. I scowled at him. "You're the dumbass." Zev just grinned. "That's the thing about being me," he said. "Always one step ahead." "Zev, I swear to God!" And suddenly a hand was clamped down over my mouth. I tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. Another hand grabbed me by the throat, raising me into the air and pulling me tight against the body of my attacker. The hand over my mouth tasted like dirt and grass. My attacker was wearing a gardening glove. I could feel the rough texture of a matching glove against my throat. And I couldn't breathe. I was hanging from the grip around my neck, choking and gasping. Zev was still standing in front of me, grinning. He hadn't noticed that I was being attacked. "Mmm!" I tried to yell. "Mmm!" I swung out with my elbow, slamming it into the body behind me, but the blow landed against something soft with a quiet sound like the crunching of dried leaves. I could feel a rough shirt against the skin of my elbow, and a painful sensation where a piece of straw poked out of the shirt and pierced my skin. I suddenly realized that I could feel more pieces of straw poking against my back. Panic seized me as I realized that I knew what was choking me, the scarecrow. I started flailing wildly and kicking out with my legs. I grabbed at the hand around my throat, but beneath the straw were fingers made of steel. I pulled at the hand around my throat with both hands, as hard as I could, but it was unyielding. I couldn't breathe. The strength was draining out of my arms and legs. I could hear my heartbeat pounding against my ears. I couldn't breathe. I was dying. And Zev was still just staring at me and grinning. "You should wake up," he said. "There are things here that you still don't want to know." And suddenly, the grip around my neck was gone. I fell to the ground, gasping. I could feel my face pressed into something rough and sharp. Gravel. I didn't have time to catch my breath. I felt something hot grabbing me by the ankle with an explosion of white-hot pain. I could feel my flesh cracking and blistering under the grip. The pain was excruciating. Reflexively, I kicked out with both legs wildly, trying to shake the burning grip off of my ankle, or to maybe kick the thing that held me to get it to let go. There was a flash of light, like a camera. I spun around and saw the scarecrow, his body burning, his hand latched onto my leg. His face was obscured by the flames, but I could see the head bobbing up and down with silent laughter. Light flashed again, and again. A strobe light counting the milliseconds of white-hot agony. All I knew was searing pain and desperation for it to end. The pain wasn't just in my ankle. It had stretched itself up my leg, across my chest, all the way to the left side of my face where it seared my eye. The pain made it impossible to formulate a plan. All I could do was desperately kick at the hand around my burning ankle, trying to get it to let go, to cut off the burning, horrible pain at the source. But part of me was aware of something else, something underneath the pain, something behind the flashing light. Behind that light was Isabel. No, not Isabel. An energy, a presence, a comfortable warmth. Respite from the horrible burning pain. There was a woman there, not Isabel, but another woman, someone matronly and strong, someone who wanted to look after lost children. I could feel that presence tantalizingly close, just out of reach. I reached out to the energy and felt it rushing toward me, embracing me. The horrible, burning pain vanished. I spun around to see the scarecrow. He was pulling his hand back from my ankle as though my flesh had started burning him. There was a crackling sound. I felt a tension, a buzzing sensation across all of my skin from my body and out into all 4 of my limbs. And then, without thinking, I raised my left hand. In an instant, I felt the quivering energy rushing toward my outstretched finger. There was a flash of light and a roar of thunder. A bolt of lightning flew from my hand and simply shattered the scarecrow. Scraps of burning cloth and straw rained down from the sky. All that remained where the scarecrow had been was a blackened crater in the gravel. I heard a voice whisper in my ear. Zev's voice. "Typical," he said, irritated. "All you want to know is what cool tricks you can do." I turned to face him. I was standing, though I couldn't remember rising to my feet. I could feel cold, wet grass under my toes. Zev was still standing in the shadows of the forest that was now standing opposite the farmhouse, where the cornfields were supposed to be. The moonlight glinted off of his bleached blonde hair. "I don't understand," I said to him. "If you aren't going to let me tell you anything, you might as well wake up," Zev said. "What are you talking about? I'm not doing anything to you." "All right, fine," Zev said. "You want to hear the truth?" Zev straightened from where he stood, leaning against the tree, and took a step forward. The flickering shadows across his face suddenly converged into black tendrils that seized his wrists and pulled him back, spread-eagled against the tree. His head slammed against the wood with enough force to make him grunt, but his grin stayed in place, only looking a little pained. I didn't want to go into the woods, but I was concerned about Zev. The way his grin was staying fixed on his face was creeping me out. I rushed over to him, feeling a sudden chill when I passed into the shadow of the forest. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching him. Zev's wrists were still pinned against the tree by shadowy tendrils. "All locked up tight," Zev sighed. "Nothing's getting through this. You sure learned your lesson." "You're not making any sense," I said, raising my hand in front of him. "Zev, how many fingers am I holding up?" "Hey, I'm trying to tell you," he said. "You can run, but you can't hide. He's not going to stop just because he didn't get his way over there." Zev tilted his head to indicate the burning building behind me. The farmhouse was gone again, replaced by the offices of the Riverside Sentinel. Flames enveloped the building, just as hot as before. "He's coming," Zev said, his voice a whisper in my ear. Had he gotten loose somehow? I could feel his breath against the back of my neck. I turned back toward him and flinched. He was standing free, right behind me, his arms folded across his chest. "Who's this he you keep talking about?" "We don't know," Zev said. "We? But we've got to be ready. You at least want to know that." I crossed my arms in irritation. "Why are you being so evasive?" Zev shrugged and smiled. Then his fist swung out fast, slamming hard into my jaw and knocking me off my feet. I could feel my jawbone cracking, splitting down the middle with a sound like glass shattering. Chapter 19. Consciousness returned to me in a single, disorienting instant. For half a second, I felt comfortable, safe, and warm. I could feel one hand wrapped around my shoulders and another underneath the crook of my knees. I was being held, my shoulders and head slumped against a huge, warm body. For a moment, I thought that my father was carrying me. I became aware of something else, a spicy smell, vinegar and garlic. Hot wings, I thought. We must be in some kind of restaurant. And then I remembered that I wasn't a child, and that if someone was carrying me, it wasn't my father. I was taller than my father now. Someone bigger than me was holding me. Holy crap, he was huge! My eyes snapped open, and my body started flailing in panic. I could hear my own voice gasping with fear and surprise. I flung out my arms and legs wildly, and I could feel one of my fists strike against a solid, muscular chest. I tumbled out of the grip and fell onto the ground, hard enough to knock the breath out of me. Despite the shock of the impact against my back, I just managed to tuck my chin and keep the back of my head from slamming against the floor. I gasped in a breath, dazed. I had landed on something soft, a carpet or maybe a rug. I wanted to raise my fists, but my back had taken the full force of the impact, leaving me stunned. Another smell caught my attention, something soft and floral. My ears were ringing. I could hear a man's voice, but I couldn't understand it. And then I heard Isabel's voice. "Eliza, it's okay." I saw a woman bending over me, her blonde hair a curtain around her head. Her hair was glowing, like a halo. She was fuzzy. My eyes weren't focusing. "What?" I said. I could still feel my jaw aching from the phantom pain of the dream, and I was relieved to find that my mouth was intact and working. "It's okay," Isabel's voice repeated. I blinked at her. My eyes started to clear until I could make out Isabel's face. Her head was bent over me in front of a fluorescent light set in the tile ceiling, which was the reason behind the halo of light around her head. "What happened? Where am I? And what's that smell?" "I brought you here," Isabel said. You collapsed, and I collapsed?" Oh, right. I could remember it happening, and I could remember why. The monster, the scarecrow, the thing that had tried to kill me as a child, the memory coming back to me. I hadn't wanted to believe it had really happened. I had shoved that memory down as deep as it could go and convinced myself that it was my father's version of the story that had been true, the version I had heard him tell my uncle and aunt to explain what had happened. I had told myself that monsters weren't real. I had been telling myself that for my entire life. But all along, part of me had known. I blinked again and noticed that another face was bent over me next to Isabel. A huge, square face that brought with it a suddenly intense, spicy smell of red pepper and vinegar. A slight underbite gave the impression of a bulldog, but the black fuzzy hair and huge hunched arms and shoulders made the man resemble a gorilla. I groaned as my brain finished booting up. I was lying on the floor of a building. Isabel and Vince Doberman were squatting over me. Isabel's arms were folded, her expression worried. "You all right there, kid?" Doberman asked. He was grinning. What did that grin mean? Did Doberman think it was funny that I had fallen to the ground? "You brought me to him?" I demanded, glaring at Isabel. Why did she trust this guy? That was when I realized that the huge, firm chest I had been pressed against must have belonged to Doberman. It had been his arms that I had felt holding me, the jerk-ass strip club owner who had insulted me. I felt disgusted. I didn't know if it was entirely fair, considering that Doberman seemed to be trying to help me, but I just didn't like the idea that the guy had been touching me. Isabel was biting her lip and glancing between Doberman and me. "She said she smells something," she said. "Is that like a concussion?" "Well, we did just clean the carpets," Doberman said. The big man turned back to me. "Hey kid, how many fingers?" He held up a few. "Shut up," I said. "I'm fine." To prove it, I started rising unsteadily. "Whoa, take it easy." I ignored him. I felt like crap, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself up onto my hands and knees. I took a deep breath and managed to rise onto my feet, but I felt weak and shaky. My body was sticky with sweat, too. I felt like I had just come down from a high fever. As I managed to rise, I took stock of the room I was in. A few couches were pressed against the wall. On the other side of the room was a big desk below a painted logo declaring that this was the lobby of the Doberman Motel. When I made it to my feet, I turned to glare at Doberman. There was no way a man like him would help me out of the goodness of his heart. What was he getting out of this? The spicy vinegar and pepper smell was still strong in my nostrils. I realized that it was Doberman's breath, or maybe he had spilled sauce on himself somewhere. The smell was really strong and definitely coming from him. Isabel was reaching for me, as though concerned that I needed help to stay upright. I waved her away. "I'm fine," I said. That gentle, floral scent emanated from Isabel's direction. It must be her shampoo, lotion, or something. I really was smelling everything more strongly than I normally did. Was Isabel right? Did I have a concussion? If so, I had to put that on the back burner. I leaned toward Isabel and dropped into a whisper. "Why would you bring us here?" Doberman rolled his eyes. "I can hear you," he said. Isabel glanced nervously between me and Doberman, biting her lip. "I came for help," she said. "From him, though?" I didn't bother to continue whispering. I didn't understand why Isabel trusted Doberman so implicitly. He ran a strip club. Since when is that the job of an upstanding guy? And it was even possible that he was the one who had sent those animals after us, although he wasn't a top suspect now that I had a chance to think about it with the fuzz over my memories lifted. "What, Gully, you think you're too good for this place?" Doberman snarled. I felt my fists clench when Doberman called me girly again. He had remembered how I had glared at him when he called me that last time. I remembered, with refreshed outrage, how Doberman had taunted me when I had left his club, saying not to come to him for a job if he got me fired because I was too ugly to work there anyway. I'd be damned if I let this asshole push me around. I rounded on the huge man, clenching my fists. I stepped toward him, wanting to glare at him harder, to really get in his face, but my legs were still a little wobbly, so I ended up stumbling. Doberman put out his arm to catch me before I could fall. I reached out and grabbed his arm instinctively. After I got my balance, I flung my hands away from Doberman as if I had just touched a hot stove. "Keep your hands away from me," I muttered. I knew I was being ridiculous, but the guy just plain pissed me off. And with how terrifying it was to suddenly realize that I was living in a world that included monsters that stalked children, it was hard to want to be reasonable. "Yeah, fuck me for trying to help him, alright?" At that moment, a door behind the counter creaked open, distracting us. Doberman and I both turned to see a concerned-looking elderly woman with thick librarian glasses stepping out of what looked like an office. I realized that I had seen her before, working behind the counter at the strip club. "Is everything all right out here?" she asked. "It's fine, Ma," Doberman said, his voice suddenly gentle. The old woman shrugged and then turned to go back into the office, closing the door behind her. I just stared at the big man for a moment. Doberman's mother worked with him, and behind the desk at the strip club, too? Was he really so shameless that he didn't mind his mother watching him ogle his employees? Or did Isabel actually have a good reason for trusting him? I had dismissed her opinion of the man yesterday, when she had said he couldn't possibly be the killer, but that was before I had realized that Isabel actually had good reasons behind her strange behavior. I blinked at Doberman. He was still glowering at me. The silence was long enough for Isabel to get a word in. "Eliza," she said quietly, "I brought you here because I trust Vince, and he knows things." I frowned contemplatively. I knew that it was possible that I had misjudged Doberman, but it was hard to stay rational when the memory of his insults still stung and angered me. The big man was still glaring at me. A moment passed. "You work with your mother?" I said. "Hey, don't talk about my mother. I was just surprised." Doberman frowned. He still looked irritated, but maybe a little less. I started to feel like maybe I should apologize for how I had been acting, but a large, and perhaps somewhat childish part of me didn't want to. He was the one who had started it, threatening to get me fired, calling me names, saying I was ugly. Just thinking about the things he'd said was making me pissed off again. I bit my tongue and tried to make my tone polite. "Isabel, what do you mean he knows things?" "Vince is the reason Angie wanted to come to Riverside." That was when it clicked. More information in the back of my mind that was transformed by what I had just learned about the world. Riverside was a pretty small city, with just a handful of towns around it and a giant state park enveloping the rest of the area. But despite its size, Riverside had all those Wiccan festivals, 4 each year. I'd gone to one for a story once. That was when I had met Reuben Chalmers. And I had just figured there were a bunch of crazy hippies in this town. "Riverside, it isn't like everywhere else," I said. Doberman grinned toothily. "Just figured that out, did you?" I glared at him. "Do you always have to be such an asshole?" Doberman's grin just widened, and he turned toward Isabel. "This kid's all right," he said. I felt my fists clenching. I couldn't tell if Doberman meant that as a jibe or an actual attempt to make nice and bury the hatchet. But either way, I didn't like being called kid much better than I liked being called girly. "Listen," Isabel said, stepping between us. "Vince said he can try to look after us until we can get to the airport." "What?" I said, turning toward her. "Airport? What are you talking about?" "Loads of people there," Doberman said. "Nobody I've seen can do much near that many. And there's cops there, too." "No, I mean, Isabel, you're leaving?" I said. "But how do you know whoever's after you won't just track you down?" Doberman frowned and looked thoughtful, which is to say he screwed up his face and looked like a gorilla trying to solve a math problem. I don't think they'll follow," Isabel said. "If we run away, they'll know we aren't going to try to cause any more trouble." "What, you think they'll see you surrendering and just accept that? Whoever's doing this just tried to kill you earlier tonight, and—" I was cut off by a sudden, putrid presence in my nose. It smelled like a septic tank had exploded. I jerked my head reflexively over to look outside the glass door and into the parking lot. I could see Doberman in my peripheral vision. He had spun in the same direction and had raised his fists. The smell came from the far end of the parking lot, where one of the lights was out. Through the shadows, I could see a tall, gangly figure stepping out of a pickup truck. He was wearing a cowboy hat, and I could see a silvery gleam on the brim, a gleam that probably indicated the presence of a silver star. Reuben Chalmers. The man who had lifted the van, which meant that Chalmers knew about magic and had a power of his own. And right after I had asked around about Angela Miller, he had come to threaten me, to tell me not to stick my nose where it didn't belong. Chalmers was my top suspect for the attacks. There had been a haze over my thoughts that had kept me from putting it together, distracting me from thinking too much about the fact that I had seen a man lifting my van with one hand. But that haze was gone now. "Get behind me," Doberman said between clenched teeth. He stepped forward, placing himself between us and Chalmers. The tall man in the cowboy hat was striding toward the building, and I could see him clearly enough now that I knew for certain it was him. "What's happening?" Isabel said, her voice high-pitched with fear. "There's something wrong with that man," Doberman said. "I can smell it." My eyes widened and my nostrils flared as I realized what was happening. I was smelling what Doberman was smelling. But why? Angela Miller could manipulate fire. Isabel could create little fairy lights. Doberman had some sort of ability too, something that included the ability to smell Chalmers coming from relatively far away. And somehow, I was smelling the same thing. In that moment of realization, my sense of smell intensified. I could pick out Doberman's spicy odor. It was rising, becoming richer and more intense, getting ready for a fight. The floral smell that was Isabel, meanwhile, was waning, as if it was trying to hide. And the putrid sewer smell of Chalmers, something about that smell told me that the gangly man wasn't merely dangerous. There was something deeply wrong with him. I couldn't just smell the three of them. I could smell where they were. I knew without looking that Isabel had run behind the counter to hide. I could feel it in a primal way I couldn't account for. It was unlike any experience I had ever had. If I closed my eyes, I thought that I could probably still tell where Doberman, Isabel, and Chalmers were. Because my nose wasn't the only sense that had gone into overdrive. I could feel the clothes against my skin and the air stirring against my hair blowing from a vent in the ceiling a few feet behind me. I could hear the sound of Isabel's panicked, unsteady breathing. I could hear Doberman's heart start beating faster as Chalmers drew closer. The darkness of the parking lot rapidly faded in my vision until it looked like twilight outside. I could see Chalmers clearly. I could see his face and the lazy look in his eyes, even beneath the shadow of that black hat with the gleaming silver star. There was something off about his gaze. The man looked bored, glazed over. It was like he was in some kind of trance. And then there was that smell, telling me that something was deeply wrong with him. I clenched my fists and glanced at Doberman. He had lowered his hands, holding them loosely at his sides. His slouched posture conveyed a deliberate lack of concern. He was trying to act like Chalmers didn't scare him. But I wasn't fooled. I could hear his heart beating. I could see the tiny beads of sweat in the pores on his forehead. I was frightened, too. I could feel the tension in my muscles. I felt like my whole body was a compressed spring ready to strike, or maybe to sprint away. I tried to force my breathing to slow as Chalmers reached the glass door to the motel lobby and pulled it open. "Reuben?" Doberman said. "Reuben, man, you okay?" So Doberman knew him, and he seemed surprised. If I had to guess, I would think that Chalmers hadn't smelled like sewage the last time Doberman had seen him. Chalmers ignored Doberman. Instead, he turned to me. "My boss asks that you come with me," Chalmers drawled. His voice sounded flat, almost as if he was barely paying attention to his own words. "What?" I said. "Why?" "Just come with me," Chalmers said, "and bring the girl. I know she's here." From behind me, I could hear a gasp of fear. Chalmers' gaze snapped toward the counter Isabel was hiding behind, his eyes suddenly alive. I stepped in front of him. "What do you want with her?" I demanded. "And who is this boss of yours?" The gangly man's left hand twitched, and I almost jumped back on reflex. His expression changed to something strange, almost pained. His jaw was clenched. My heart was pounding furiously against my chest. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. "Reuben," Doberman said, walking toward him. "What's wrong with you?" Chalmers jerked his head toward Doberman while the rest of his body continued to face me. His left arm was jerking more violently. "Get back." Chalmers grated the words out, as though trying to talk through a locked jaw. But Doberman kept walking toward Chalmers, his expression concerned. "Reuben, He was cut off when the lanky man spun his fist toward him, slamming a punch into his gut. I could see individual beads of spittle from Doberman's mouth flying into the air when the punch connected. Doberman fell, gasping, onto the ground. Doberman groaned, and I saw him start to rise. But then Chalmers casually flicked his cowboy boot into Doberman's face, and the huge man fell back, arms splayed out on the ground. The red pepper smell emanating from him faded. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious. I took a couple of steps back from Chalmers, terror exploding up and down my spine. Chalmers had just incapacitated a gorilla of a man, a bouncer, with as little apparent effort as though he had swatted a fly. Chalmers turned away from Doberman immediately, as if the man he had just brutalized no longer existed. I didn't understand. Doberman had called Chalmers by his first name as if they had been friends. That was when I saw it. Chalmers was like the dog or the bear. His mind was not his own, and whatever was trying to compel him to act, he was struggling to fight against it, and failing. "Chalmers," I said, what did they do to you?" The man's eyes snapped back toward me, and tension suddenly fled from his expression. He looked abruptly calm and bored again. "Just come with me," Chalmers drawled. "I'll take you to your friend." Who? My heart skipped a beat. Zev? Is Zev alive? I had never wanted to give up on finding Zev, on saving him from whatever trouble he was in, but my hopes had been dwindling down like a flickering candle. "Zev Jackson," Chalmers confirmed. Hope exploded in my chest like a burst of flame. Zev was still alive. I was going to get him out of this. Whatever insanity was happening, I was going to save him. "But his continued welfare depends on you," Chalmers said, his words hitting me with a stab of dread and fear. "I need you to come with me," he continued, "and bring that girl with you." Fear brought with it a renewed urge to try to run. I had seen Chalmers lift my van. I knew how strong he was. And he had just effortlessly taken out Doberman, who was a good foot taller than me and twice as heavy. I couldn't fight this man. What if Zev wasn't alive? What if this boss of Chalmers just wanted me to believe that he was? Maybe I should just run away. But if I did, I might be condemning Zev to death. And I would be abandoning Isabel. She had been kind to me. She had gotten herself hurt trying to warn me about the danger I was in. I took in a breath and tried to meet those bored, glazed-over eyes. I had to stay. I had to master my fear. "What do you want with Isabel?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady. I could feel my hands shaking. "Boss wants her," Chalmers said. He took a step toward me and I leapt back, a literal leap that took me 5 feet back, all the way to just in front of the check-in counter. Shock at how quickly and agilely my body had moved pushed back against my fear. The motion had been easy and instinctual. It was as if I had practiced leaping backwards 5 feet through the air dozens of times. It wasn't just my senses that were stronger. It was my reflexes and my coordination, too. It was almost as though time had slowed down while I was moving. It was so easy, so instinctual. Chalmers saw me move, saw my hand stop shaking, and he barked out a laugh. "Try anything and I'll break your legs," he said, "like snapping a twig." The absolute confidence and casual tone of the man terrified me. He really wouldn't hesitate to hurt me, to break my bones. It would matter to him as little as anything else in that trance he was in. "Maybe I break the girl's legs too, just to be sure," Chalmers continued. "Shove you both in the back of my truck. With broken legs, you ain't getting away." I had to snap him out of it. I had done that twice now, to both the dog and the bear. I just had to remember what I had done. I had felt Something, and I had seen something in their eyes, like a green light. I couldn't see that light in Chalmers' eyes, despite the fact that my senses were sharpened. And I couldn't feel that energy I had hurled against the bear either. I could see and hear and smell and feel way too many things, but that thrumming power was gone. Chalmers started cracking his knuckles loudly. "You got exactly 1 second, he said. Shit, I didn't know what I was doing. Panicked, I flung my hand out, exactly as I had done when I had driven off the bear with that flash of light and burning smell. Nothing happened. "Have it your way," Chalmers drawled. The gangly man's black coat billowed out behind him as he rushed forward and swung his leg at me. I could see his eyes, follow them, track them. I could see the moment when he shifted his weight so that he could send his left leg swinging out toward my kneecap. So I made sure my kneecap wasn't there. Even without looking, I knew exactly where the desk behind me was. I jumped back, higher than I would have thought possible, and landed spryly on top of the desk. Chalmers's eyes moved toward me, slowly. More slowly than I could move. With a flick of my ankle, I sent a stapler sailing in the air toward his head. I kicked it as easily and accurately as if I was a professional stapler soccer player. The little metal object hit him hard in the middle of the forehead, sending his stupid silver-starred hat flying off. "Bitch," Chalmers growled. His eyes were not vacant now. They were enraged. Emotion, I thought. But was it waking him out of the trance? Chalmers rushed toward the desk, fists raised. "You don't want to do this," I shouted at him, hopping back behind the desk. I could see Isabel quivering in a ball underneath the tabletop. "Chalmers, snap out of it!" My words had no effect on the man. The pain I had caused him had made him angry, but maybe he was being allowed to feel that emotion because it would motivate him to move toward his goal. Maybe Chalmers only had that bored expression when the mind control couldn't find any other emotions to use to motivate him to carry out his orders. The gangly man seized on my moment of hesitation, swinging out one fist and slamming it at the desk standing between us. The wood splintered, and I could see a huge chunk of it flying at me. I fell to my knees and threw my arms out in front of my face. Fragments of wood pelted my arms, but the biggest chunk missed and embedded itself in the wall behind me. Heat and pain lanced up my left arm, followed quickly by a sudden, shocking cold and wetness. One of the splinters had slashed a cut across my elbow. Isabel was screaming in terror, shaking with fear. A cold menthol scent mixed into the floral smell coming from her. Terrified as I was, I wanted to protect her. If Chalmers decided to simply destroy the desk between us on his way toward me, he might inadvertently kill the woman. He knew she was here, but he didn't have the instinctual awareness for her exact position that I had. I leapt up into the air over the now badly damaged desk. I moved as fast as I could, really shoved my muscles into it, making them burn from the effort. I tucked my feet under me to clear the desk, and then swung my fist out. My knuckles slammed into the side of Chalmers' head with an explosion of pain. With my enhanced senses, the pain in my fist was also amplified. The man's head didn't even move when I hit him. It was like punching concrete. My feet hit the ground, and I could see Chalmers' lips curling with rage. My fist stung with intense, distracting pain. Chalmers turned and took a swing at me. I only just managed to duck under the blow, crouching down beside him with my feet and my hands both on the ground. Chalmers swung out with a kick, and I rolled forward to avoid it. The motion was taking me nearer to where Doberman was laying, still passed out, where the hot pepper smell still lingered. My senses were distracting me with too much information. I was struggling to stay focused on what mattered. Even a glancing blow from Chalmers might fracture one of my bones. And I knew that if Chalmers injured me, this would all be over. The pain in my fist was excruciating. I was sure that a worse injury would leave me screaming and crying incoherently on the ground. I somersaulted away from Chalmers and sprung up onto my feet. I could smell the gangly man following close behind, so I simply ran for the front door, hoping that the rage I had inspired would keep Chalmers's attention on me so that Isabel could escape. I didn't have to turn to see him following. I could hear his breath and smell his putrid scent. I could feel where he was the same way I could still feel where Isabel was hiding under the desk. I had to focus on Chalmers. I had to ignore everything else. Every other sight, sound, and smell. None of that was as relevant as the man who had threatened to break both of my legs. I ran out into the center of the parking lot. I had to make sure I stayed somewhere well lit. I had to keep Chalmers's attention on me, had to keep him from looking back toward the building. Maybe then Isabel would have a chance to escape. I spun around. Chalmers was just now shoving his way through the glass doors. I glanced behind him. Maybe I could spare just enough attention to keep an eye on Isabel, to see if she was managing to... Chalmers reached down and lifted up the back wheels of a sporty-looking green coupe. Then he shoved his arms up and sent the vehicle flying through the air, aimed right at me. My jaw dropped open as I scrambled to one side. My ponytail was flung out behind me, and I could feel the car hit my hair as thousands of pounds of steel flew past me. I was struggling to catch my breath. I was moving faster than I would have thought possible, and it was tiring me out. All this running and dodging and jumping at breakneck speed, I didn't know how much more of it I could do. But Chalmers wasn't finished. He moved to the next car in line, a red SUV. The gangly man shoved one leg forward under the front of the car and kicked, flipping the vehicle up onto its back. I was still 10 feet away, breathing hard. Relief spread through me. The SUV was too heavy for Chalmers to simply toss into the air with his foot. But the gangly man took one step forward and kicked. Metal sparked as the SUV came squealing toward me across the parking lot, sliding on its roof at what looked like 30 miles an hour. Adrenaline flared into my aching lungs and burning legs. With a tremendous effort, I shoved my feet against the ground and leapt up into the air, trying to jump over the SUV as it rocketed toward me. My body rose, but too slowly. The hatchback was going to hit my legs. I pulled my legs up, grabbing my knees with my arms. I could feel the disturbed air whipping below me as the underbody of the huge vehicle passed inches from my tailbone. The tires flashed past me on either side, more than high enough to hit me. If Chalmers hadn't been so dead on with his aim, I wouldn't be right in the dead center of the car where nothing protruded quite high enough to hit me. The SUV slid past me, but I had messed myself up. Swinging my legs up into the air had unbalanced me. I tumbled and fell to the ground, flailing. Again, I managed to tuck my chin to keep the back of my head from slamming into the pavement, but when my back struck, the wind was knocked out of me and my vision blurred. Pain from the impact exploded up and down my spine, and for a second, there was nothing else I could even perceive. My senses were amplifying the pain, taking it beyond a level I had ever experienced. My entire body felt like it was exploding from the center outward. My lungs were burning so painfully I didn't think I could ever take another breath. The pain from the moment of impact lingered, agonizing. I was dying. I was sure that I was dying. My vision was nothing but gray and flickering light. The pain was too much. The pain was everything. Gradually, unbearably slowly, the pain started to lessen, but not to leave. And then I saw him, Chalmers standing over me, a bored expression back on his face. I felt a hand seize my ankle and lift it. Icy fear plunged into my stomach. I started flailing out, kicking at Chalmers with my other leg, grabbing at the ground with my arms as the gangly man lifted me into the air by my ankle. I felt Chalmers's other hand grab my calf just below the knee. I flailed out, kicking desperately. I felt my foot slamming into the man's face, but he ignored me. My furious kicking was nothing to him. I tried to aim for his eyes, his nose, anything to stop what he was about to do. I heard a loud, sickening popping sound. At first, I was sure that it was the bones of my leg breaking, but there was no pain. The hands slackened and the bottom half of my body slumped back onto the ground to join the rest of me. I looked at Chalmers. He was reaching behind him, feeling for something. His hand came back slicked wet with blood. Chalmers looked at his hand, still looking bored. And then I heard him mutter under his breath, so quietly that even I could only just barely hear it. "If you get hurt, come back," he whispered. Chalmers turned away from me and staggered toward his pickup truck. Blood dripped from his back onto the ground. I saw a compressed, deformed bullet on the pavement behind him, a bullet that I knew must have ricocheted off of the back of Chalmers's skull. It hadn't been able to penetrate the supernaturally hardened bone, but it had caused a bloody flesh wound. Vince Doberman was on his knees inside the motel, behind where Chalmers had been standing. A tiny wisp of smoke was rising from a pistol in his hand. My back hurt, like it was covered in one huge bruise. I was sure it was going to be, but the pain was quickly becoming bearable. I realized that my palms were stinging. In the shock of the impact, I must have slammed my hands against the ground, just like you're supposed to when you're falling. I had mitigated the impact. I was probably fine. My enhanced senses were exaggerating the pain. I heard Chalmers's truck coming to life. He had whispered his orders to himself. I was sure that it was only my enhanced hearing that had allowed me to hear it. Chalmers had been told to go back to his boss if he got hurt. And Chalmers said that his boss had Zev. I had to follow him. I couldn't let him get away. I clambered to my feet. My back hurt. My tailbone hurt. My arms and hands hurt. But I was moving, and my body responded to me smoothly enough that I knew I wasn't actually injured. I heard Chalmers's truck starting to pull away as I jogged back toward Doberman, a jog that, on any other day, would have been better than any sprint I could have managed. "Isabel!" I shouted. "I need my keys, now! Doberman, get her to the airport!" Chapter 20. I threw open the door to my van and jammed my keys into the ignition. I could see Chalmers's pickup trapped behind a brown sedan at a red light. And I could still feel the blood pumping in my ears. I could smell gasoline and oil as the van came to life. The streetlights and headlights were distractingly bright, if not quite blinding. I struggled to focus on only what was relevant as I whipped the van into reverse and slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. I struggled to focus my mind on the task at hand. Shards of glass were scattered across the parking lot, and a few of them were large enough to threaten to pop my tires. I felt hyper-aware of everything, and that was helpful if I focused on the right details. I had an intuitive sense of where each of my 4 tires were, and I could keep track of where the largest glass shards were even when I couldn't see them. Hoping that none of the tiny glass shards were large and sharp enough to damage my tires, I weaved my way through the parking lot and around the battered green coupe and SUV that Chalmers had thrown. Then I peeled out into the road, just as the light that Chalmers and the brown sedan were trapped behind turned green. I grinned and almost giggled with glee. I was the pursuer now, and it felt amazing, like my adrenaline rush was also being amplified. A small voice in the back of my head tried to remind me about how terrifyingly strong the man was. I knew that I should still be frightened of him, but I also knew that if I let him escape, I would just be waiting for the next time he was sent to attack me. If I ran now, I would spend the rest of my life living in fear. And the thrill of my newfound dexterity felt amazing. When I was running for my life and struggling to dodge friggin' cars that were being thrown at me, I had been too terrified to appreciate just how kick-ass my speed and reaction time had become. I felt like a stunt driver. No, I felt like a goddamn superhero. A large semi-truck was pulling out of the driveway of a tobacco shop, blocking the road. Chalmers was on the other side of it. If I waited for the semi, I might lose track of him. I couldn't have that. I felt my lips curling into a wild smile as I saw my path forward. The van bounced unsteadily as I popped over the curb and onto the grass median between the parking lot and the road. The aging suspension squealed with a sound so piercing it made me flinch, but I gritted my teeth against the unpleasant sensation and kept my eyes on the road, spinning the wheel to the left and slamming the gas pedal to the floor. I bounced off of the grass median and swerved out ahead of the semi. Pain lingered in my ears as I spun the wheel to the right and lifted my foot from the gas. I had made it in front of the semi, but that swerve had been too sharp. The van was going to start fishtailing. Terror gripped my heart and squeezed it. The van whipped uncontrollably behind me, swinging wildly over the yellow line and into the shoulder. I had overestimated myself. I was losing control. An oncoming minivan slammed on its brakes to avoid hitting me with another piercing squealing sound that made my ears explode with pain. On a normal day, I would have lost control of the vehicle, but today, my reaction time was inhuman. Wincing through the screeching brakes, I reacted instantly, pumping the brakes as I turned my wheel into the direction of the skid. And then I righted myself just in time. The oncoming minivan went squealing past me, missing by inches. Ahead of me, Chalmers had apparently heard the commotion. He sped up, driving his huge truck onto the shoulder to attempt to pass the brown sedan in front of him. Horns were blaring so loudly that I almost thought I could feel the sound slamming into my eardrums, but I managed to slam down the gas pedal in an effort to catch up. The red pickup raced into the shoulder next to the brown sedan. There wasn't enough room for him to pass, but Chalmers did not stop. There was a crunching sound and a pop as the red pickup truck snapped off one of the brown sedan's mirrors. The brown sedan started pulling over in front of me, hazard lights on, and ahead of it, the red pickup started to accelerate. I swerved to pass the sedan on the left, crossing the double yellow line. I had the gas pedal pressed all the way to the floor. The van's engine was roaring, but even at top gear, my acceleration felt painfully slow. At first, it looked like the red pickup would win the contest of speed, but after a moment, I started gaining on Chalmers. I couldn't believe it. But then, too late, I realized why the man was allowing me to catch up to him. He had slowed down to prepare for his next maneuver. The red pickup screeched its brakes and swerved onto a dim country road shrouded by trees. I was going too fast to make the turn, but if I missed it, it would take time to turn around, time I couldn't afford. Chalmers would get away. So, biting my lip to prepare for how horrible the sound was going to be, I slammed on my own brakes and twisted the wheel to the right. The van lurched into the turn, and it looked like I was going to make it. I was going to end up on the wrong side of the road, but there was no one there. That was when I felt the van start to tilt. The huge vehicle was rising up, the wheels on the passenger side lifting off of the ground. I was going to flip over. Shit, I wasn't even wearing a seatbelt. This was going to hurt. I was sure that I had realized what was happening too late, that all I would be able to do was brace myself for impact. But time was stretching out as the tilted angle increased. I had just enough time to think of something and do it. I pulled my foot off of the gas pedal and leapt up out of my seat. I passed the steering wheel from my right hand to my left as I moved, keeping the wheel steady as I jumped over to the passenger seat, throwing my weight onto it. The force of my body pushed the van's center of gravity back. The tilting of the vehicle slowed and started to reverse. I just barely managed to keep my grip on the wheel as the van slammed back onto all four wheels with a squealing protest from the suspension. My body was prepared for the fall, and I took the force of it comfortably, but my ears hurt so badly I wouldn't have been surprised if they started bleeding. There was no wet sensation, so I had to assume that my eardrums hadn't been shattered, but the pain lingered and my ears were ringing with echoes of the horrible squealing sounds. For a microsecond, the pain disoriented me, but then I was leaping back into the driver's seat, passing the wheel from hand to hand again. The red pickup was disappearing around a wooded curve in the road, the rear lights reflecting off of a pair of yellow signs warning of a sharp turn. That was when another idea struck me. On my way back to the driver's seat, I grabbed a knob next to the steering wheel and twisted. My headlights went out, but I could still see as well as if there was a full moon, despite the fact that the sky was black and overcast. I drove into the darkness of the country road, following the pickup around the bend. With the shade of the trees, it was dim, but Chalmers had his headlights and taillights on, lighting him up like a beacon. The road was dim and empty, no streetlights, no other cars. But I could see plenty well enough to drive. I eased off the gas pedal. I would have to stay back, trusting to the darkness to hide me as I followed the red pickup. I lost sight of Chalmers every time the dark road rolled up and down a hill, which was often. Gradually, the red pickup started to slow down, to drive normally. I felt a surge of confidence. Chalmers didn't see me. He didn't know I was following him. And so I drove behind him in the dark, deeper into the old, decaying parts of Dover. We passed a used car lot and a couple of vacant, decaying industrial parks. I had to pay careful attention and keep myself far enough back that Chalmers wouldn't see me following. But I had to balance that with not falling so far behind that I would be unable to see if the red pickup took a turn. Several times, all I had to go on was the dim glow of the red pickup's lights shining from just out of sight along the winding, twisting roads. Chalmers was leading me deeper into the woods, up onto the hanging hills, misnamed perhaps, because the hills themselves were a series of trap rock ridges. The only thing I knew of in this area were the Metacomet trailheads that you could take on hikes up to Mount Ascutney. Could Chalmers's boss be waiting for him at a campground? Or at the summit of the mountain itself? I turned around another particularly sharp bend and came to an intersection, but I saw nothing but an empty four-way stop. The foliage was too thick. I couldn't see Chalmers's taillights. Had he gone straight? The road ahead bent sharply to avoid a hill. I looked left and right. To my left was a straightaway. If he had gone that way, I would still be able to see him by the light of the pickup truck. To my right, another sharp curve to avoid the same hill as the road straight across, but in the opposite direction. Damn it, I'd lost him. But then an idea came to me. I didn't know if it would work, but it was worth a try. Moving quickly, I started cranking down my window and sniffing at the air. My nose was filled with the acrid smells of burning oil and gasoline from the van. But faintly, underneath those smells and many, many others, I was sure that I could detect a second set of vehicle emissions. I turned the van to the right, leaving my window open and following my nose. The farther I went, the more certain I became. This was the trail of the pickup truck. I could smell it. I followed the scent down the road for a ways and then came to a stop next to a driveway of crumbling asphalt that looked like it hadn't been maintained in at least a decade. The driveway curled up a forested hill, but halfway before the driveway turned to disappear into the trees, I saw the red pickup truck. I had followed Chalmers successfully. I was worried that the man might see me if he turned to look down the hill, but he couldn't see in the dark like I could. I could see the gangly man stepping out of his truck. He had parked it in front of an old and rusted fence that ran across the driveway. Next to where he stood, I could see a faded "No Trespassing" sign. I held my breath at the bottom of the hill and watched as Chalmers opened the fence, got back into his pickup, and drove through. After that, he got out of the truck again so that he could close the fence behind himself. I saw no sign from his body language that Chalmers realized I was watching him. With the fence secure behind him, Chalmers got back into his truck and continued driving up that winding road, disappearing into the trees. This must have been it, I thought. Maybe there was an abandoned building up there. Definitely some kind of hideout. There was something strangely familiar about this driveway. Part of me was sure I had seen it before, but I just couldn't place it. Or maybe my enhanced senses were playing tricks on me. Either way, it didn't matter. I knew what I had to do. I had to follow Chalmers up this hill. I pulled my van onto the side of the road next to the driveway, parking underneath the shadow of the trees. The van was huge, white, and painted with a red logo on the side, so there was no hiding it from anyone who passed this road. I would just have to hope that the police didn't see it. If my van got towed, I would be trapped out here in the middle of the woods. I put the van into park and then hesitated. What was I doing? I thought of those cars flying at me. I remembered the booming, crunching sound of impact as the car Chalmers had thrown into the air struck the ground. That car had to have been at least 1,000 pounds, probably more. That man had a truly insane level of strength, miles beyond any bodybuilder. It was literally inhuman. Chalmers could probably kill me with his pinky. I felt my breath start to quicken. My chest tightened. I wanted to turn the van back on, turn around, and drive away. Drive and never stop. I could do it. I could just drive away. How far would Chalmers chase me? On the other hand, when Chalmers had kicked Doberman in the face, he hadn't killed him. Maybe he had been told not to. Or maybe he hadn't wanted to. Maybe he had been able to hold himself back from whatever it was that was compelling him to come after me and Isabel, the influence that made him smell like an exploded septic tank. I was fairly certain that Chalmers was being mind-controlled somehow. It fit with the way Doberman had spoken to him as if they knew each other, but Chalmers had barely acknowledged him. And there was that glazed-over look and the muttering of his orders under his breath. Chalmers's boss would be waiting past that fence, at the end of that road. If the boss was there, I wasn't just going up against a man with the might of Hercules. I was probably going up against someone who could completely control another person. And animals, too. This mind controller most likely was responsible for the dog and bear that had attacked before. It was terrifying and wrong. That man had been enslaved, made into a tool with no will of his own. If I followed Chalmers, that might be the fate that was waiting for me. That might be the reason Chalmers had been ordered to bring us back. I should just go, start driving and not stop until I get back to Indiana, until I pounded on my father's door and got him to let me inside. I wanted my father to hold me like I was a little kid again, like he hadn't held me in more than 10 years. I wanted him to tell me that he would protect me, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt me. But if I did that, and Chalmers came after me, he could rip through my father like he was made of tissue paper. And something even worse could happen. The person who had turned Chalmers into a slave might enslave my father too. Was Chalmers even still alive, somewhere behind those bored eyes of his? Could I help him? Throw off whatever spell he was under? If I could set him free, his insane strength would be on my side. When I had kicked that dog and hit the bear with that burning flash of light or whatever it had been, they had turned to flee. The dog had looked almost confused, all traces of aggression gone from his canine face. The spell had been broken. But Chalmers had taken a bullet to the back of the head, and that hadn't done a thing to stop him from following his orders. That was when I realized why Chalmers had been told to return. He had told me himself. Zev. Chalmers said that if I didn't go with him, Zev would be hurt. Zev was supposed to be a hostage to gain my cooperation. And now, Chalmers was on his way to report back, to tell his boss that I hadn't come quietly. Would the boss send Chalmers back with Zev's severed finger, showing me what would happen to my friend if I still refused to cooperate? If I ran away, I might be leaving Zev to be tortured to death. Put that way, I had no choice at all. I had to keep going. I might be marching into my own grave, or into something even worse. But what other choice did I have? And I could see in the dark now. I could try to make my way up the hill through the forest, blend into the shadows, and listen to what Chalmers tells his boss from a distance. It was worth a try. If I was successful, I would know what I was up against. And if it came down to a fight, I would have the element of surprise. That wasn't nothing. Now I just had to hope that I hadn't wasted too much time sitting in my car and trying to decide what to do. I took in a deep breath. My hand shook a little as I grasped the van's driver's side door and pushed it open. The sky was dark and overcast, no moon in sight. The woods were alive in a way I would never have been able to fully appreciate without the help of my enhanced senses. The wind rustled the branches of the trees, the crickets chirped and sang, and underneath it all, I could hear the faint sounds of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Chalmers's truck had disappeared up the hill. I had no way of knowing how far the road extended into the woods, or how difficult it would be to follow him on foot. But if I didn't want to be seen, driving up the hill seemed like a bad idea. My vehicle was too conspicuous. So I finished stepping out onto the cracked asphalt. I closed the van door, locked it, and turned to look at the fence across the driveway. It was old and starting to rust, the sort of fence that was clearly only meant to stop vehicles from driving past it and to provide a place to hang a no trespassing sign. The gap in the fence gate was more than wide enough for me to slip through. I walked up and pushed my way through the gate, hearing the metal rattle in my ears. I knew the sound was amplified for me, but it made me nervous. I tried to step carefully, to make as little sound as I could. I walked over to the side of the road, to where the trees shrouded the undergrowth in shadows. I just had to hope it was dark enough under the trees to hide me. It was hard to tell. To my enhanced vision, the pale skin of my arms practically glowed in the dark. I was sure that my face was just as bright. But I couldn't spare the time to cover myself in mud or something like that. I had already wasted too much time when I almost chickened out and drove away. The hill was steep. I was glad to be wearing a pair of jeans that stopped the overgrown grass from tickling my legs. I hated that feeling. And there may have been ticks in the grass. The fear of Lyme disease was a strange concern for my mind to occupy itself with, considering what I was walking into. But it was there. Or maybe I just didn't want to think about worse things that might be about to happen. As I crested the hill, a worn-down building came into view. It was 2 stories, and it looked kind of like a warehouse, but it had old, brown siding like a barn. Many of the windows were broken and boarded up. A weather-beaten sign in front of the building read, "Dover Ball and Socket." It was the button factory, I realized. The name Dover Ball and Socket referred to metal snaps that were considered new and innovative when the business took its name. They also made traditional buttons, including some that were used for military uniforms during World War II. The decaying building and weather-beaten sign were icons of how far Dover had fallen. I had to approach carefully in the shadows of the trees. I watched my steps, avoiding any sticks or leaves, moving more silently than I ever could have without my enhanced senses. My first move would be to watch and listen. I had to find out what was going on, who Chalmers's boss was, and whether or not they really had Zev. If I was lucky, the element of surprise might enable me to grab Zev and start running. If I got us out into the darkness of the forest, maybe we could get away. I drew as close to the building as I could without leaving the shadows of the trees. I strained to filter out the songs of the crickets and the rustling of small animals in the forest and tried to focus on the sounds coming from the building. Very faintly, I thought I could make something out. Could it be footsteps? Abruptly, a new smell filled my lungs, new and overwhelming. There was the iron smell of blood underneath the smell of a flower. The scent somehow brought to my mind the image of a rose bush with blood-stained metal thorns made for ripping into flesh. A rose bush that stalked its prey, tearing its victims into pieces with a cloud of gore. I focused my perception on the terrifying smell and on the presence behind it. I listened harder, struggling to push every other sound out of my head. Yes, I thought, It was faint, but someone was inside the building, walking on a hard surface. Pacing, maybe, waiting for something. I lost track of the footstep sound almost immediately. The night was full of sounds. The woods were full of rustling and creaking. The wind was constantly stirring the trees. There were dozens of small animals moving about, and the crickets were a cacophonous chirping over it all, so loud that it threatened to drown everything else out entirely. The smells were overwhelming too. There were so many plants, so many smells. The woods were full of animal droppings. I could smell dung with unpleasant sharpness. It was an acrid scent that felt like it was going to burn the hair out of my nose, almost as bad as Chalmers himself. I struggled to try to direct my attention to the building and to ignore everything else. But getting my ears to focus was a lot harder than getting my nose to pick up that blood-stained rose scent. That scent was overwhelming, overpowering to my nose the same way the cricket sounds were overpowering to my ears. I cocked my head, trying to turn my right ear toward the building. There had to be some way for me to focus better, to pick up the sounds that I was sure my enhanced hearing would be able to detect. I just had to ignore everything else that was competing for my attention. All the rustling and crashing sounds in the woods didn't matter. All that mattered was that building and trying to figure out what was going on inside it. I closed my eyes, trying to focus exclusively on the information coming from my right ear. I was sure that I had heard footsteps before. I just had to filter out everything but the sounds that mattered. I could hear the building creaking as a gust of wind blew against it. When the wind died, I was sure I would be able to make out those footsteps again. The wind rose and then fell. Footsteps, I was sure of it now. Someone was moving inside that building. Something else was moving in the bushes behind me, distractingly loud. Probably just a squirrel. I tried to tune it out. I had to listen to the footsteps. Were there 2 sets of footsteps or only one? A hard grip suddenly clamped down on my left wrist. I screamed. Chapter 21. I screamed in shock and surprise and tried to pull away, but the grip on my wrist was as immovable as a steel vise bolted into a concrete wall. As the scream erupted from my throat, my eyes shot open, but the light of the moon immediately started dying, leaving me in blackness. The cricket song went quiet. Cold fear stabbed into my chest as I was plunged into blind darkness. I struggled harder, flailing and thrashing. I slammed my fist into the person who had grabbed me, but it was like punching a wall. My hand exploded with pain. But before I could even react to the pain in my knuckles, another grip lashed out and slammed onto my other wrist, shoving me backward and pinning that arm against a tree. I almost lost my balance as my arm was wrenched back. I would have fallen to my knees, but the grip on both of my wrists was keeping me painfully upright. "Hold still," a man's voice grunted. Chalmers. My stomach was still churning with panic. I managed to plant my feet back on the ground and just writhed in the man's immovable grip. "You don't stop fighting, I start breaking bones," Chalmers drawled, sounding bored. The breath caught in my lungs. I froze. Taking my paralyzed state for cooperation, Chalmers moved my wrists, lifting my arms over my head and spinning me around until he held my arms behind my back. Once I had been forced into position, the tightness of the grip around my wrists slackened, still secure, but not crushing and painful. I was terrified, and somehow ashamed. I had stopped struggling. All it had taken was a few threatening words. I had thought that I would be stronger than that. The man's voice came from the blackness of the forest behind me. "You should have run when you had the chance." He sounded strained, like he was choking out the words. I couldn't answer him. I was hyperventilating. "Guess you thought you were the only one who could see in the dark," Chalmers forced out, sounding like he was talking through his teeth. I couldn't see in the dark anymore, I thought. My enhanced senses had started dying the moment Chalmers's grip had locked onto my wrists. The power had slipped through my fingers, vanishing like an exhaled breath. I didn't know why it had happened in that moment. Maybe my batteries had finally worn out or something like that.
"Should have remembered,"
Chalmers grunted. Shit, of course. When Chalmers was in the parking lot of the restaurant after he lifted the van, he had just walked off into the darkness of the forest. It had been strange and disturbing, but I had put it out of my head. And when I had stopped trying to suppress the memory, it had been the man's strength that had stood out to me, not the fact that he had walked off into the woods at night. That strength now had me by the wrists. Given what the man was capable of, Chalmers was probably being fairly gentle. That didn't comfort me much. Dread was rattling in my lungs, forcing my breaths to come fast and irregular. Chalmers could probably rip me in half right now if he wanted to. It would be a horrible, painful way to die. But he hadn't done that, at least not yet. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe some part of his mind was rebelling against whatever force had made him smell like sewage, a smell that would have alerted me to his presence before he had grabbed me, if only I hadn't been trying to ignore my sense of smell at the time. There was no scent to tell me that Chalmers was not in control of himself now, but that grating way that he was talking was evidence that my unenhanced senses could still perceive. But why was it such a struggle for Chalmers to say that I should have run when I had the chance, then to taunt me about forgetting that he could see in the dark? We were just standing in the forest. His grip was firm around my wrists. He was warning me. Chalmers realized that I had forgotten that he could see in the dark, and he wanted me to know what he was capable of. It was a struggle for him to tell me because even though it sounded like taunting or threatening, it wasn't. It was a man whose body was not under his own control, trying to give me the only advantage he was capable of giving me. He wanted me to know what he was capable of so that I could use that information to get away from him. My heart was pounding in my chest. This would be my last chance to get away. I swung my foot in a backward kick and slammed it against the man's shins. As the kick landed, I flung my wrists against the grip that held them with as much strength as I could muster. I might as well have kicked a wall. I groaned with pain as my arms were pulled back against the socket of my shoulders.
"Sorry,"
Chalmers grated out.
Can't let you go."
Then his voice changed, sounding calm and bored once again.
"Walk forward," he said.
The grip on my wrists tightened painfully. Chalmers turned me toward the building, steering my arms like the handlebars of a bicycle. I had to cooperate to avoid having my shoulders dislocated. I couldn't breathe. Chalmers pushed my body forward and I stumbled.
"Walk," Chalmers said. "If you force me to, I will break your legs and then carry you."
My voice made a squeaking sound, and I started walking forward toward the building. I was terrified, and humiliated at how terrified I was. Whatever was going to happen to me, I didn't want to face it like this. I was on the verge of tears, but I wouldn't let them come. I could do that at least. Even if I couldn't speak, even if I couldn't stop hyperventilating and shaking with fear, I could at least keep from crying. "Let me go," I whispered. My voice was quavering. The grip on my wrists tightened, but the man did not speak. Maybe I was reaching him. Maybe he just needed more motivation to resist the orders he was being forced to follow. I was getting control over my voice again, over my panting breaths. "You don't have to do this," I said. "Whatever's going on, you can fight it, you can— Ah!" I groaned in pain as Chalmers pulled my wrists tighter behind my back, one quick tug that wrenched agonizingly at my shoulders and elbows.
"Shut up,"
Chalmers whispered. His voice sounded strained.
It's too late. You had a chance to get away. You should have taken it."
"Please," I said. I couldn't stop my voice from rising in pitch, sounding more desperate and afraid. "Please, don't do this, just let me go!"
"Walk forward," Chalmers said. Don't make this harder than it has to be. No, please, you don't! The grip on my wrists shoved into my lower back, forcing me to take a step forward to avoid toppling over. Walk, Chalmers said. I walked, but I didn't stop talking. Reuben, I said, please. Chalmers ignored me and continued to shove me forward, out into the parking lot. Reuben, I said. Reuben Chalmers, please, you don't have to, He twisted one of my wrists painfully, but he didn't stop pushing me forward. I had to stumble forward awkwardly, bent at the waist. Chalmers gave me no time to catch my balance. He just continued pushing me slowly forward toward the button factory. I staggered forward, barely managing to keep from falling. I bit my lip. My vision was swimming with tears. I was ashamed of the tears, but I couldn't stop them. It was all I could do to keep myself from sobbing or whimpering as Chalmers forced me to walk toward the building. We came to a stop in front of a rusted metal door. I clenched my teeth from the pain in my shoulder as Chalmers forced my wrists together toward the small of my back and switched to grasp both of them in one hand. With his free hand, the gangly man reached for the door handle. This was my chance to break free, while Chalmers was distracted. But I was too afraid. The man's strength was incredible. Even with just the one hand, I was sure that if he squeezed my wrists with his full strength, he could crush my bones. So I stood there, terrified, waiting while Chalmers used his free hand to grasp the door handle and shove the door open. Light came pouring out into the night. I could see a propane camp lantern on the floor of a huge brick room. Much like the warehouse of the Riverside Sentinel, the floor was pitted with concrete troughs where machinery had once rested. Next to the lamp, a mattress lay on the floor. Above the mattress was an IV stand with a nearly empty plastic bag hanging from it. The line from the IV went down onto the floor, no longer connected to the figure laying on the mattress, covered with a small blanket. A young woman was kneeling on the floor next to the figure, but I barely noticed her. I was looking at the person laying on the mattress. My heart leapt when I saw that he had brown skin and bleached blonde hair. I tried to step forward, but the one-handed grip around my wrists held me back. Unable to move forward, I craned my neck to see around the kneeling woman and managed to catch sight of the face of the boy on the bed behind her. It was Zev. Zev! I shouted, unable to contain myself. I couldn't believe it. I had been determined to believe that he was alive, but I had been starting to lose hope. But what was wrong with him? Why the IV? I looked at the blonde woman. She was looking back at me, smiling. She was dressed casually, jeans, a white tee under a denim jacket, and a ball cap that she had pulled her ponytail through. The woman looked to be in her early 20s and was definitely pretty. Not gorgeous, magazine pretty like Isabel, but a plain, wholesome sort of attractiveness. Her bright green eyes almost seemed to glow in the dimness above a pointed, fox-like nose that was exaggerated enough to be memorable without being a beak like mine. Zev, the guy on the mattress, is he okay? I asked urgently. The woman looked like she had been tending to him. The blonde woman stood up, slowly. She was still smiling at me. It was a kind smile, but I didn't understand why she wasn't answering me. What happened to him? I insisted. Is he okay? Eliza, the woman said, her tone of voice indicating recognition. Hey. Did this girl know me? I thought her voice sounded familiar, too. I looked at her, trying to place her in my memory. There was something familiar, too, about the way she had her ponytail pulled through the back of that ball cap, blue with a red logo. But I was distracted away from her hat by her eyes, bright green eyes, almost glowing. I could remember something, a dream. Those eyes glowing in the dark. And the scarecrow, I thought that they were his eyes. But what were eyes like that doing in the kind face of this young woman? I heard a whispering sound coming from behind me, but I knew somehow that the sound wasn't real. It wasn't truly in my ears, but in the back of my mind, almost like having a song that was stuck in my head. And just like that, it was inescapable. The sound wouldn't go away. And I wanted it to go away. It was painful. It was the sound of a swarm of scorpions scuttling around in a dark cabinet. I needed to keep that cabinet shut, to keep that horrible scuttling away from me. But the sound wouldn't stop. It was clawing at me, raking at my mind. I felt like I might pass out. I swayed on my feet, kept upright only by the grip holding my arms behind my back. The madness was spreading. It became more than just sounds. I lost track of the sight of the young woman in front of me as visions started swimming through my head, visions I did not want to see. The scorpions were trying to get out. I saw the scarecrow holding a knife high over his head, his face in shadow, but under the brim of his head, above the twisted smile, I could see those eyes, glowing green, the same bright green of the fox-nosed woman standing in front of me. The grip on my wrists kept me from falling forward, but I felt my arms pulled behind my back at an excruciating angle. The weight of my body was threatening to dislocate my shoulders. The pain kept me from being entirely overtaken by the visions. I tried to focus on the pain, to what really existed in the here and now. I had to close that dark cabinet full of scorpions, close it and lock it up tight. But the visions did not stop. I saw Zev standing in the doorway of his room at Northside Residence Hall, looking irritated. And then I saw him splayed out on the floor. Behind him, smoke was billowing upwards. With that image came a feeling of panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. What was I going to do now? The emotion that came with the image was frighteningly intense. But I knew, somehow, that what I was seeing wasn't me. I was seeing through the blazingly bright eyes of the woman in front of me. Her mind was like a scorpion. If I let it in, I would lose myself. These visions she was trying to put into my head would rip me apart. I tried again to force the visions away, to focus on the agonizing pain in my shoulders as I hung from Chalmers's grip. But underneath the horror and the desire to force the visions away, I knew that part of me was curious. Was what I was seeing real? Was this what had happened to Zev? Part of me wanted to embrace the visions and damn the consequences. Why had the woman with the green eyes come after Zev? From what I had seen, she had come to his dorm room. There was an argument and a fire. The woman with the green eyes could control fire. Was she actually Angela Miller herself? Had she been the one who had taken Zev and attacked me and Isabel? Maybe she could do more than just control fire. Maybe she could control other minds as well. I was in the woods. I had laid Zev's body on the ground, but I could hear the rustling of the undergrowth behind me. Someone was coming. I heard a woman's voice, Mel's voice. I whirled around and fire leapt from my hands. I heard Mel screaming with pain and saw her clutching her arm where it had been burned. Panic and guilt roared through me. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. What had I done? This was supposed to be easy. I had been told it would be easy. I was such a piece of shit. I had failed at doing something that was supposed to be easy. The intensity of the emotions terrified me, flattened me. And then there was that scorpion sound, scuttling underneath it all. I didn't want to see the visions at all anymore. I didn't want to be here. I had seen enough. I had seen enough! I realized that I was screaming at the top of my lungs. Someone was moving in front of me. I could see the motion somewhere above the scuttling sound, beneath the flashing images in my eyes and the phantom sounds in my ears. It was all too scattered. There was more images, more sounds, more flaring thoughts and emotions associated with them, but I couldn't make sense of it. If it kept up, it would rip my mind apart. And then I heard a voice whispering in my ear. And suddenly, the visions were gone. I came back to myself and realized that the grip that held my arms up and behind my back had released me. I had fallen, sweating, panting, onto my hands and knees. I could feel a gentle hand on my left shoulder, steadying me. It was the woman with the green eyes. She was staring at me, looking both intrigued and concerned. And then I saw the hat on top of her head, and saw it clearly. Her eyes were no longer blazing and distracting pools, trying to pull me into visions of the past. They were just eyes now. so I could meet her gaze. I could look away, and I could look directly enough at her to see the red emblem on the blue hat. It was a Red Sox cap. That was when I realized that I knew her face, that nose and those eyes. She looked very different, but there was no mistaking it. "You!" I said. "It can't be!" This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.